about 3 years ago, a group of us amateur historians were meeting, and we were looking ahead to 2026, and we said, you know, there's been a fair amount written about Cape Cod and the islands during the Revolutionary period, but a lot of it's 19th century and a lot of it's kind of out of date, and it's here and there, and it needs to be consolidated. And so we came up with the idea of a single book that would collect the highlights of information about what happened in the Revolutionary period, and to do it in time for the big 250th anniversary, which is, of course, next year. So this book has only been out about 10 weeks, but it seems to be filling the need that we had hoped. So what I'm going to do is give you the highlights of certain events and people, and probably I ought to just say a little bit about the way the book is organized first. It's in 4 sections. The first covers the period 1761 to 1774, and you'll see the reasons why in a minute. Then 1774 to mid-1776, and you can guess the date of that. Then the third section, 1776, mid-1776, to the peace treaty in 1783. And then a last section on 10 biographies of key people in Cape and Islands who played a role in the revolution. And so if you'd like to purchase the book, well, I'll have it available at the end, but I'd like to just jump in right away and look at what we have in front of you on the screen. That is the result of a tremendous search, because we've all seen pictures of old Cape Cod where there's distortions and the outer peninsula is up straight when it isn't really. And we searched for something that was reasonably accurate and up to date at the time. And we found this one map that was done by a German cartographer named Blaskowitz, who was in the employ of the British government, and the date is 1775. And it's not easy to try to figure out, well, why then? Because the British knew that there was trouble brewing, and they needed an accurate map of this whole region for themselves. And so I'm very pleased, actually, that we have this, and it's in the front of our book. And there's very little distortion. I think the lower part of the peninsula is a little bit incorrect in terms of being elongated. But other than that, it's pretty accurate and pretty detailed for the time in terms of harbors and the little villages that existed at the time. So this was done probably for military purposes, but of course it serves our historic needs very well as well. Next slide. So the first question that we ask is, well, when did the revolution really begin? And there are some interesting alternative answers to that question, and I'd like to get your thoughts on that too. But let's look at some chronology first of all. Next slide. Now here we have a skeleton history of the Revolutionary period with a few Cape Cod things sandwiched in between. I'll have a more detailed one later on. But 1761 is the date when James Otis Jr. of Barnstable Village made a fiery speech in Boston against what was called the writs of assistance, which is basically British search warrants that now gave them the right to research, to search things that related to navigation and trade when they had not ever required that before. And that is a part of the supposed origin of the idea of taxation without representation, although that was elaborated on later. And then, of course, we have 73, the Cape residents and towns were boycotting English tea very much, and we'll talk about some of the parliamentary acts. 1774, I'll talk about the closing of the Barnstable Court, and of course we have Lexington and Concord, and Cape Cod was involved indirectly in that. Of course, the Declaration, And then, interestingly enough, in 1776, George Washington ordered a survey for a possible Cape Cod canal. Now, I thought that was kind of interesting. Of course, we know that Miles Standish was the first one to propose it in 1627, and it only took him 300 years to build it. But in any case, that's kind of an interesting military aspect. I'll talk about the big significant shipwreck on the Outer Banks of Truro, and what we might call the only, quotation marks, battle that was fought on Cape Cod soil. And then, of course, the things ended. The surrender was 1781, but we didn't have an actual treaty for 2 more years. And then, of course, we had the Constitution 4 years later. So that's just kind of a skeleton outline with a few inserted Cape Cod events. But let's go back to the question of when did the revolution really begin? Next slide. Look at that quotation. Now, we know that John Adams and Thomas Jefferson were big leaders in the production of the Declaration of Independence. They were colleagues. Then they became political enemies, and they each ran for the presidency of the second president's position, and then the third one, and each one won once. And they didn't patch up their differences until pretty much after the War of 1812. We're not really certain when that was. But then started an absolutely outstanding correspondence that went back and forth from Quincy, Massachusetts to Charlottesville, Virginia. These 2 great men were reflecting during the rest of their lives to each other about what the meaning of independence was, what America was all about. And the great news is we have all of that correspondence. And so there's this quotation mark here, and I'd just like to read that because I think it really says something, at least in John Adams' opinion. He says, what do we mean by the Revolutionary War? The war was no part of the revolution, but only a consequence of it. The revolution was in the minds of the people, and this was an effort from 1760 to 1775 before a drop of blood was shed at Lexington. A people's revolution involving farmers, tradesmen, craftsmen, and we could add fishermen to that, the middling classes. So that's John Adams' take on when the revolution actually started. And he's going back, and he says, of course, that the armed conflict was a consequence of it, but something had happened before that. So I happen to think that John Adams was not really correct about that, or was not complete about that. And in our book, in the first chapter on the antecedents of the revolution, the question is raised, well, what happened before 1760 that might be considered planting the seeds of the revolution? Any dates come to mind, thinking back to our everyday knowledge of American history, which preceded 1760, which might have actually started the ball rolling?
The massacre in front of the coffee shop.
Okay, very good. That had something to do with actually galvanizing the resolve to try to do something about British rule of the colonies.
I thought it was 1772, I think.
Yes, 73, yes. Go back further than that. What about before 1760? There's some everyday common dates that are in our minds about some things that happened before that.
What about the Tea Party?
The Tea Party was actually within that time period, yeah. Well, here we are right on Cape Cod. What was the big important event that happened in Provincetown and then Plymouth?
The Pilgrims.
Yeah, 1620. Now, some historians say, wait just a minute. Let's talk about what happened in 1620. Here's a group of people who were coming to populate the New World, and they were way off course. They were supposed to be at the mouth of the Hudson, and they ended up off of Cape Cod. So they had a mandate to settle this so-called Northern Virginia colony, which is what the area was called, but they were not where they were expecting to be, and they knew they weren't. And so there was a need to have a kind of document that said, hey, we're all going to kind of hang together here, because there was a danger that some of the people who were not there for religious purposes were going to go off and start doing their own thing, so to speak. And so the Mayflower Compact was a document that some people consider to be one of the founding documents of our country, because it said we're going to act collectively and we're going to deal with self-government. Now, I'm sure that the Pilgrims didn't think about this becoming a new nation 150 years later. But the fact of the matter is that you could say that the seeds of independence were, in a sense, planted right there in Provincetown Harbor, which is Cape Cod. So I just throw that out. And there are some other events that happened in between that I won't take time to go over. But in any case, the formal recognition is that something began to happen in the early 1760s. And one of the things that happened there was that was the end of what's called the French and Indian War, or as the Brits call it, the 7 Years' War. And so Britain had successfully, with the colonists' help, managed to defend the territory that was west of the colonies from the onslaught of French and Indians, and in so doing, they had run up a debt. And they had run up a big debt. And Parliament says, we've got to do something about that, because we need to pay off the East India Company, which is a foundation of the British economy. And they said, aha, the colonies are a good source of revenue. And so they began a series of parliamentary acts that built and built and built and built. So let's go to the next slide and start taking a look at some of these things. This is the cumulative effect of what you would call parliamentary resolve to make the colonies pay back some of the revenue so that the debt could be paid off. And in 61, I've already mentioned, of course, the writs of assistance. The next 2 years, of course, later was the actual end of the French and Indian Wars. And then 64, we have the Sugar Act. Guess what that was a tax on? That's easy to guess. There had been a Molasses Act before that in the 1730s. But then we have, in 65, the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act was a tax on all forms of paper, and paper was very scarce in the colonies. You had to use it for mortgages and deeds and letters and so on, and so every time you were going to use a piece of paper, you had to pay a tax to the British government. Well, that really rankled people big time, and so they made a big hue and cry about it, and Parliament said, okay, we'll cancel the Stamp Act, but we're going to add another act the next year, 1766, which was called the Declaratory Act, not very well known. And that gave the British government the right to tax the colonies at the same rate as in Britain, which was never the true before that. So that said, all right, we'll take one thing away, but we're going to do this, and that was even worse. And then a parliamentarian named Townsend in 67 said, we're going to put taxes also on some china, glass, lead, paper, paint, and tea. So now you can see we've got things coming on top of each other. And it wasn't, that lasted for another 3 years before they were repealed. In the middle of that time period was the Boston Massacre in 1770. Then it's not clear who fired first in that. It may have been a patriot, it may have been a loyalist. And John Adams defended the British soldier who was arrested for having done that. But in any case, now we have the Townsend Act says, okay, we'll take all away those taxes except for tea. Tea was really important in that period. And so then we have the formation of what's called committees of correspondence. Now they happened throughout the colonies, but the first one was in Boston. And a committee of correspondence was basically a group of people that got together to discuss their grievances against the British Crown. And that idea of getting together and talking about this spread after Boston to the other colonies. The Tea Act in '73 was, of course, reinforced the tax, and then in that same year, as we know, a group of colonists dressed as Indians got into Boston and threw away a lot of bales of tea into Boston Harbor. Some people think that it must have been at low tide because a lot of it was retrieved, but we're not sure about that. But we're not done yet. Then along the next year, British government is getting really ticked off at these colonies, and so we're going to pass even more stringent laws, that what they call the coercive acts and what we call the intolerable acts. And that was directed specifically at Massachusetts and said several things. First of all, you guys don't appoint your own governors anymore. We're doing it. And then secondly, they closed the port of Boston because there was too much going on there, rabble-rousing. And then, and this is what really bothered a lot of people, it said, and you have to quarter our troops. Now think about that. You have a house in Boston, you're not wealthy, and the British government comes along and says, and we got soldiers that we're stationing in Boston, and by the way, you have to put them up in your house. Well, you can see, if you add all those things together, you're going to have something that's going to cause an explosion. Next slide. The Stamp Act caused a lot of reaction, of course, on paper. And John Adams, in his diary in '65, writes that the enormous engine fabricated by the British Parliament for battering down all the rights and liberties of America, I mean the Stamp Act, has raised and spread through the whole continent a spirit that will be recorded to our honor with all future generations. He's a wonderful writer. In every colony from Georgia to New Hampshire, inclusively, the stamp distributors and inspectors have been compelled by the unconquerable rage of the people to renounce their offices. And so he's talking about the rebellion against the Stamp Act after it had gotten passed and implemented. So again, we're indebted to John Adams' writing skills. Next slide. So let's come home to Cape Cod. There's the Otis family of Barnstable. The family had originally emigrated to Hingham and then moved down to Barnstable. And there are three important figures here. Colonel James Otis Sr. was a judge appointed by the Crown, and he was a judge in the Court of Common Pleas in Barnstable Village that I'll talk to you about in a minute, and which there's a picture of. And he had two children, James Jr., known as Jemmy by his sister Mercy, and James Otis Jr. was the one who made the fiery speech against the writs of assistance. I've never known a man whose love of country is more ardent or severe, never one whose services for any 10 years of his life were so important and essential to the cause of this country as those of Mr. Otis from 1760 to 1770. Huh? How come it stops at 1770? John Adams, writing in 1818, knew what had happened. James Otis Jr. was a firebrand, and he got into a terrible argument with a loyalist in a Boston pub. And the other man struck him on the head with a cane. And James Jr. was never right thereafter. And he went into a mental decline. Some people say that was going to happen anyway, but at least it was precipitated by that. And the story has a sad ending, but it can't take away from those 10 years when he truly contributed to it. The sad ending is that in his mental decline, he said, I would like to die by a bolt of lightning. And in 1783, he deliberately stood in the doorway of a house during a thunderstorm and was struck and killed. But that does not take away from his major contribution to us, and this is right here on Cape Cod. Next slide. And there is a painting of him railing against the writs of assistance. And John Adams in 1817 says, American independence was then and there born, if you don't go back into the earlier century, as I just suggested. Next slide. His sister Mercy, who married Dr. James Warren, was a very well-educated woman, and for her time, women were not well-educated at all. They were not provided with that opportunity, but she saw her brother getting educated, and she asked to be tutored, and she later produced very important writings, and this is a front page of one of her treatises in 1805, where she's looking back at the Revolution in 3 volumes. So she made very much of an intellectual contribution as well. Next slide. We had liberty poles in at least 3 towns that we know of, Sandwich, Yarmouth, and in a place on Martha's Vineyard, known today as Vineyard Haven. And a liberty pole, as you probably remember, it was a rallying place. It was an actual physical pole, and it had a Patriot flag at the top. And it became a center point in some villages for people to keep themselves enthusiastic about doing something about the British government. There was an incident that happened in Martha's Vineyard, and I think we can go to the next slide. This is a painting of 3 young women preventing the British from taking the liberty pole of Martha's Vineyard. And let me tell you the story of that. The British government, both Army and Navy, was 3,000 miles from home. And as happens with all invading armies, you run out of supplies, and so you have to try and get the supplies from somebody local, namely the enemies that you're trying to attack. And I'll come back to another example of that in a minute. Well, there was a British ship captain who put into the harbor, one of the harbors in Martha's Vineyard, and said, I have a broken mast, and you have that liberty pole, and that's just going to be perfect. I would like to have the liberty pole, and we're going to take it. And so obviously the colonials said, no, we don't want you to have it. And the story is, and it hasn't been 100% verified, is that 3 teenage girls got a hold of gunpowder, and they got hold of an awl, which is a kind of a drill, and at night they drilled several holes in the base of the pole, poured gunpowder into it, lit it, and it blew the liberty pole to smithereens. So they kept it out of the hands of the British captain. If you go to Vineyard Haven today, and I've just been there 24 hours ago to see this, there is now a pole. They had to keep it from being too high because of some current day regulations, but it's there right in the middle of the village of Vineyard Haven, and it has a plaque on it, and it's about the right width. It's just not the height of it there. So these existed in different places as rallying points, and they were, of course, on Cape Cod. Next slide. Then we have the Cape's role in this whole tea business. In the 1778, I think it was, there were 7 ships that set out from England loaded with cargoes of tea. 3 of them went elsewhere, like the Caribbean and so on, and 4 were headed for Boston. Well, only 3 made it. And so our friend, the Shoals off of Truro, caused one of the ships, the tea ships, the William, to founder. And of course, the cargo of tea was threatened. They managed to rescue a lot of it, and these are now the local patriots. So now they've got a problem. Here, all of a sudden, as a kind of a gift, we have a whole lot of tea. What are we going to do with it? And they had four choices. They could drink it, they could sell it, they could destroy it, or they could return it to the British. And a little of everything in that list of four things actually happened. A good deal of it was returned. But in any case, that is Cape Cod's direct involvement with the Tea Party. Apparently, the other three, of course, made it because the report of the Boston Tea Party says there were 3 large ships who were raided by colonials dressed as Indians. And of course, we just recently celebrated the 250th anniversary of that event. All right, next slide. Then there's the story of Nantucket, a completely different story from Martha's Vineyard and Cape Cod. This was an island that was divided in terms of its loyalty, and why would that be? Well, let's think back to the economy of Nantucket. Here you have Quaker merchants, and Quakers, of course, are against conflict, but these merchants were making very good money by trading whaling oil to England and getting flour and other important things in return. Why should they shoot themselves in the foot and join this rebellion that was brewing? And so the island became divided between patriots and loyalists and maintained that division right through the war. They, of course, generally joined the cause at the end, but you could say that Nantucket's history and its location and its economy, particularly based on the whaling industry, made things very different there. And we have chapters on 3 different important Nantucket figures who were part of that whole process of keeping the revolution alive. All right, next slide. Then we have our Elizabeth Islands, very near to here, of course, and that's going to play a role in a few minutes in another incident I'll tell you about. But let's just look at the geography a minute, because this was a favorite anchorage for British ships during the Revolution because it was sheltered and it was away from population, and of course there were good harbors in many of the Elizabeth Islands. So you're going to see that that plays a role, particularly in sheltering good parts of the fleet, and that's a Cape Cod connection. And you can see, of course, it's a very short sail to the Vineyard from there, if you want to conduct raiding parties, for example. I'm going to come back to Noshawn Island in a few minutes, so let's just look at carefully one of the particular placements of that, because that is a strategic location. Okay, so now we'll leave the first period behind and go on to the second period of time, 74 to mid-76. And there are a number of events which are listed here, and I'm going to just give you a quick minute to look at those, and then we'll go into some detail. The last bullet that's there is something that I won't take time to do separately, but you remember that one of the battles of Ticonderoga, the Patriots managed to capture some cannon and dragged them all the way across Massachusetts and mounted them on Dorchester Heights, pointing down at the British. And that was the point when the British said, I think we'll leave. And they evacuated Boston. And we celebrate that on March 17th, Evacuation Day, which happens to be St. Patrick's as well. A very nice coincidence. But anyway, we'll come back to these. And I will point out the fourth bullet here about Harwich. One of the things that happened was that, of course, each of the colonies, all 13 of them, voted yes for independence. But then some of the colonies said, I think we better poll the towns too. And so the Massachusetts General Court, which is our legislature, is still called that, went and polled the towns of Massachusetts. And when they came to Cape Cod, Harwich was the first to say yes. Barnstable said no at first. Why is that? What was going on in Barnstable? Well, very much like Nantucket, there were people who were wealthy merchants who were doing just fine, thank you, dealing with the British. And so they were a majority in the first vote. A second vote was taken, and then it went for independence. So, okay, we can go ahead to the next slide, and this is what was the Court of Common Pleas under British rule, and is now the Tales of Cape Cod, which you've probably seen in Barnstable Village. That's, of course, a contemporary photograph. And this is the one where Colonel James Otis Sr. was the judge appointed by the Crown. And he was approached by a group of rebels who wanted to have him close the court in 1774 because they felt that, of course, the British government needed to not be represented here any longer. I'm putting it very nicely. And so they approached Colonel Otis. Now, think about this. You're a judge, you've been appointed by the Crown, but a bunch of your friends say, we want you to step down. And supposedly one of the words of the protesters was, you have done your duty, sir, and now we must do ours. And he backed off, and he stepped down, and he closed the court, because he was a colonist. Even though he'd been appointed by the Crown, he saw that the cause was building and that was the right thing to do. So here's a great example of somebody in a dilemma and made a decision. So that, of course, is the home for what's known now as Tales of Cape Cod. And if you haven't had a chance to go there, every Monday evening from late spring through early fall, they have lectures on Cape Cod history. Wonderful, wonderful programs. Next slide. So what about Lexington and Concord? Was Cape Cod involved in that at all? Of course, this year we just had the 250th anniversary of that event. And the answer is yes, but only indirectly. And so here's the situation. Marshfield, of course, which was halfway to Boston, the British had stationed a garrison. Not a fort, but a stationed group of troops. And so the colonial militia had set an encampment nearby to keep an eye on the British. Then the word came down, this is April 1775, that we better send some militia up to Boston because something's brewing, and the British are going to try and steal our gunpowder in Lexington and Concord. And so the militia of the colonials was drawn up to Lexington and to the Boston area, and the word came down to Cape Cod, hey, now we've got a British garrison up there that's unguarded, so please, Cape Militia, get up there and replace these guys who've had to go to Lexington. So a group of Cape Cod militia got together, and they were from Yarmouth and Barnstable and Sandwich, and they started to march toward Marshfield to replace the militia who had been drawn away. Well, they got only part way, and then the word came down, hey, the British have left too. And so there was no longer any need because the British had been drawn to Boston. And so the militia from Cape Cod turned around and came home. So that's a very indirect connection with Lexington and Concord, but it does show that there was communication. Of course, horseback was the key method, and that there was impact all the way around. I should add a word about militia. There were three different categories. There was the Continental Army, which was the official army of the colonies, and people served in that on a full-time basis. And George Washington, of course, was the general of that. Then there were local militia, which were groups of people, local citizens, who were identified as militia to be drawn upon when there was an alarm. That's the word they would call it. So there was an anticipated raid, so they would ask the people in the militia to get together, to leave their farm tools behind, their fishing tools and so on, and congregate and defend the area from what was expected to be a British attack. When it was over, then they went back to their everyday work. And then there was a subset of the militia called the Minutemen. And they were militia, but who were much better trained. Whereas the ones that we call the militia were much less trained. They had a musket in their barn, and they had signed up to volunteer. So there's a three-tier kind of system: Continental Army, Minutemen, and then militia. Yes?
Well, I heard, I was a Bedford Minuteman when I was much younger, that to be a Minuteman, you had to do what the British did to qualify, and that was load and fire your musket 3 times within 1 minute.
Very good. That's very helpful. I appreciate you saying that. I didn't know that. So that was one of the skills that you had to pass to be.
Minuteman.
Yeah. And you were an actor for the Minutemen yourself?
Yeah. I was in ceremonial
Right.
Bedford Minutemen up
Right.
there. I was a musket man.
Okay. Well, then you're going to relate to something I'm going to tell a little later then. I'm very glad you're here. All right. So that's useful as an example of how there was 3 tiers and the expectation. All right. Now, there are 2 things we're particularly pleased about with the book, and that is that there have been histories written which have given short shrift or no information to the fact of participation by indigenous groups, Wampanoag, for example, and by African Americans. And we had the good fortune of having a couple of researchers who dug and dug and dug and found information that's actually never been published before about the participation of those groups. And of course, the Wampanoag have a presence both on the vineyard as well as on the mainland here. An interesting question is, when the call went out to ask people to volunteer for the militia, of all the Cape Cod towns, the highest percentage of men who stepped up to volunteer were from Mashpee. Not the highest number, but the highest percentage. Any guess as to why that would be? Why would the highest percentage be from Mashpee out of all the Cape Cod towns?
I would think that the indigenous people would want to have protected their land at that time.
Very good. You're very close to correct on that. That is not only for the indigenous people to protect their land, but also the possible opportunity to get some of it back, which had been taken from them. Now, unfortunately, it didn't work out that way, but that was part of the motivation. So, thank you. Yeah. All right, next slide. This is what we would call open-ended research. It's still in process. So far, we've identified 24 African Americans from Cape Cod who actually have records of service. We didn't know some of this before. And 6 of them, additional ones, were on privateers that we haven't talked about yet. But the research is going on, and the fact of the matter is that we're becoming much, much better aware today about the involvement of our whole area in slavery, and that these, of course, in many cases were freed slaves who stepped up. So this is, again, something that's new in the book. Next slide is the vineyard. And we have, of course, another island whose history is quite different from Nantucket. Much more similar to some of the concerns on the Cape Cod itself, although there were people who were definitely on the receiving end of British help because they were involved in trade, and so it wasn't 100% in favor. But in any case, Martha's Vineyard was a favorite spot for the invading army to conduct raids to get things that they needed, such as meat, fruit, vegetables, and so on, because their supply lines, as I said before, were 3,000 miles away. It was also the place where, among other things, privateering went on. And privateering, as you know, is something that occurs when what would otherwise be called a pirate ship gets what's called a letter of marque, M-A-R-Q-U-E, from the local government that legalizes them to raid and pillage other ships from the other side, and they have to contribute a portion of what they take or steal or capture to the local government, but they can keep the rest. And so privateering was a large-scale kind of activity on both sides when you look at the involvement of Martha's Vineyard in particular. Next slide. We all heard about Valley Forge, of course, a terrible winter. In this period, that also was on the positive side when Baron von Steuben, who was a Prussian military officer, was brought to the Continental Army, and he instilled some very strict kind of disciplined training. And he really shaped up the Continental Army using a lot of the methods that were used in European wars in the 18th century. In this period, of course, privateering is going on, and this is when George Washington said, I want you to look at the possibilities of a canal around Cape Cod, because it could be a very strategic location for getting shipping back and forth without having to worry about the sandbars. Of course, it never happened, but in any case, that is a part of history. British Admiral Grey conducted raids on the Vineyard in '78, and I'm going to talk about the Somerset wreck in a few minutes. So we'll.
How populated was the Vineyard at that time?
It was not well populated. I can't give you actual numbers off the top of my head, but there were several villages, as there are today. There are towns, if you look back 250 years, it was a place that was being settled, and there was farming going on. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And people had livestock, which was...
They didn't have the whaling industry.
No, not as much, yeah. And Nantucket was well suited to the whaling industry until their harbor filled in, and then the whaling industry moved to New Bedford in the early 1800s for that reason. But the harbor in Nantucket was better, yeah. All right, next slide. This is an example of two square riggers going at it in a privateering environment. This is actually a painting that's in a museum in Virginia, and you can see that the one on the left is flying a Patriot flag. The privateering went rather well for the colonists. All right, next slide. There's, of course, the terrible winter, a painting that's in the Library of Congress showing that. And we'll go to the next slide when we have to talk about smallpox. That's another enemy that was going on for both sides. This is in the earliest years of immunization. They were just experimenting with immunization for smallpox. And this is not a very pleasant topic, but we need to face it. The method was to take the scab of a smallpox victim who was recovering and to place it on an open wound, perhaps on the arm of someone you wanted to immunize. And it had just enough of the smallpox germ that it would immunize you rather than you'd get the disease itself. And he had a large part of his army immunized. If he hadn't, I'm certain that he would have lost many more men to smallpox than to British guns. So this is interesting from a medical history standpoint, too. All right, next slide. Now we have the Somerset. In Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's great poem, The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere, which is partly fictionalized, of course, there is in the 8th verse a section which, or a stanza which talks about Paul Revere rowing silently across the Charles River to get to the other side. There's already 2 lanterns in the North Church. And he was rowing under the looming shadow of the Somerset, which is a huge British man of war. And so it was stationed in Boston in 1775 and thereafter. And so obviously that has been immortalized in that sense by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. The fact of the matter is that this ship was very important in bringing troops back and forth, particularly to the colonies, of course from England. And it turns out that there's been some legends that have grown up around it. There is a legend that it was stationed in Provincetown Harbor and that the doctor on the ship left and married a local girl and had a family, and there are descendants today. All of that is just not true. About 30 years ago, a researcher really dug into this, and it turns out that the Somerset was on its way from the mid-Atlantic to try to intercept the French fleet that was coming to be on the colonial side, and to intercept them north of Cape Cod to prevent them from coming. And it got caught in a storm, and as happened to thousands of ships, it couldn't get off the reef, and of course it then foundered on Peaked Hill bars, just the way the William did that we talked about earlier. Well, this story was different. It wasn't a tea ship, it was a troop ship. So that's a picture of a sister ship of it. We don't have a picture of the Somerset itself. So now there's a small group of patriots on the outer Cape. We don't know exactly how many, maybe 10 or 15. And very few men drowned as a result of that shipwreck. The patriots rounded up 450 people from the Somerset wreck and marched them from Truro to Boston. And by the time they got to Boston, there were no longer 450. Some had died along the way. Some probably drifted away. But they had at least 300, and they were later used for prisoner exchanges during the remainder of the war. So that was a tremendous feat in some ways, because there was a small group of patriots, and it was hard to, of course, keep them all together and so on. We know this happened because a British coin has been found on Route 6A of the time period that was clearly dropped by one of the prisoners on their way. There's other evidences, but that little coin is on display at the Yarmouth Historical Society.
Where did they house them in Boston? Where did they put the prisoners?
That's a very good question. I hate to think it might have had to be quartered in people's houses who lived there, but there's a possibility they might have erected temporary shelters. I'll have to look into that. I don't know that.
But I think that would be a historical site if there was a good location.
Yeah, well, I'm sure we can find out. In fact, I'll make it my business to pursue that. Well, every once in a while, the Somerset reappears. The bones of the Somerset, of course, are what's left over from the wreck. And this is something that happened in the 19th century. Every maybe 20 or 30 years, the ocean has, of course, washed sand to cover it, and then it washes away, and then it comes back. So this is one of the times when it had washed away, and there was enough. You can see the outline of the ship. The most recent time was about 2007. The National Park Service keeps an eye on that when that happens, and you're not allowed to take your jackknife and take any wood samples, because it's of course
Where is that located?
it's off of Truro. Yeah. Still there.
How did it go down?
It got caught in the tides, and then there was a storm, and they didn't have the wind in the right direction to be able to sail off. And just like the ship William and the others before it, they just couldn't avoid the bars, and then they got wrecked. And that, I think there's something like 3,000 ships have foundered on those what's called Peaked Hill bars. So, but of course, in this case, the Peaked Hill bars was a friend of the colonial cause. All right, now, one of the things that was an offshoot, an interesting offshoot from this whole business of the wreck of the Somerset, was that the salt industry, which is very important for food preservation, had been destroyed by the British. And the salt industry, of course, involved carving out areas of land and bringing in seawater in, letting it evaporate, and what's left is the salt. You have to build a shelter over it so that rain won't dilute it. Well, one of the good things that happened indirectly as a result of the Somerset wreck is John Sears took the bilge pump of this enormous ship and brought it back to Dennis and restarted the salt industry. So it's kind of an interesting sidelight. The next slide will show an example. This is closer to our time period. When you see the workers, they're raking the seawater and so on, and promoting the evaporation process. And that continued right through the 19th century, of course, until the advent of refrigeration. And then we come to the final big event, which is the Battle of Falmouth. And when you put the phrase Battle of Falmouth, Massachusetts into a search engine and ask it to bring you information, you find not one but two battles of Falmouth, Massachusetts. And when I knew about this one that was in 1779, but it also lists one in 1775. I said, what? I'd never heard of that. And then I remembered, oh yes, Maine was part of Massachusetts until 1820. So the Battle of Falmouth, Massachusetts in 1775 was really in what we call Portland today, because there is a Falmouth, Maine, which is near to Portland. And that was a very minor event. But this one in 1779 was significant. So here we are. The British ships are raiding both the islands and particularly Falmouth for slaughtering cattle for food, taking vegetables and fruit to feed their troops. And in that process, there was a Colonel Dimmock of the colonial militia said, we got to get back at them. And so he conducted a counter raid against the British, and that made them really upset. So they said, okay, we're going to burn Falmouth. Now, you've all heard the phrase, loose lips sink ships. That was, of course, a saying during World War II. Well, here's a perfect example of it in 1779. The next slide. All right, here's a painting that's in the Woods Hole Library showing the British boats and slaughtered cattle that have been killed for meat. We think that's probably Nonamesset Island in the distance, because this is on the Falmouth shore at Woods Hole. And then in the next slide, we have a painting of Norshorn Island and what's called Tarpaulin Cove. Anybody familiar with Tarpaulin Cove? I had a sailboat and I spent a very rough night sitting in there because a southwest breeze comes right in. You know what I'm talking about. Were you on a boat also? Yeah. But it's a great shelter. And of course, it's a painting that doesn't show the British ships, but you can see how it's a great curve, and you could station a lot of large British warships in a place like that. There were 10 of them in this particular instance. So let's go to the next slide. So here we have Norshorn Island, and next to Norshorn Island is a smaller island called Pasque, P-A-S-Q-U-E. And on Pasque Island was the home of a well-to-do loyalist named Slocum. And so the night of April 2 in 79, he was entertaining some British officers at his home. And he overheard them saying, we're going to burn Falmouth tomorrow. Now, even though he was a loyalist, he said, those poor people of Falmouth are defenseless. Somebody's got to warn them. And so what he did, he sent his 9-year-old son to row in a rowboat at night 4 miles from Norshorn Island, from Pasque Island, past Norshorn to Woods Hole to rouse the militia. And this young boy did just that. I have looked up the astronomical tables, and I found that on that night, the moon was just 2 days after full. So I think probably he was, if the weather had been good, he probably used moonlight to navigate past the islands. He didn't have a GPS or a compass, anything else, but in any case, he made it. And so he was able to, through a friend that he was staying with, alert the militia. And we'll go to the next slide. A junior high school book about the boy has been written. I have a copy of it, as a matter of fact, and that's the cover of it. It's called Night Raiders Along the Cape. So here we have the geography a little bit further. We have Norshorn Island with its tarpaulin cove in the middle, and then there's Pasque just to the left of it, or to the west of it. So that young boy went all the way from Pasque to Woods Hole. I have no idea how he navigated those terrible currents that happened at Woods Hole. Maybe he was lucky enough to be there at slack tide, but he made it. So, the next slide. So, he was able to get the word out while it was still dark. He got 220 members of the militia who got together under the Colonel Dimmock, and they got ready. And a little bit of background. Along Surf Drive in Falmouth, which is a long, I guess you could say, sand front, is a stretch of sand that they had built entrenchments for. They had built up previously the sand to a height about this high from the ground up. And so during this night, they reinforced those. It's just high enough for a man to crouch behind with a musket. And this is where I need your help. And so they got ready. And we'll go to the next slide. And this is a slide that shows the militia in the foreground, all lined up, ready, hiding, waiting for the British to come ashore. And you can see the boats approaching. This is in the Falmouth Historical Society Museum, and you can see the big ships in the distance. This is pretty much the way we think it was. And we'll go to the next slide, which is another view of the same thing. This hangs in the Falmouth Town Hall lobby. So it's a very big event for Falmouth. So here's what happened. 200 British soldiers jumped in the water and were headed toward the beach to attack and to supposedly set fire to Falmouth. And at the right moment, when they were in the water, the militia rose up and fired their muskets. And would I be right in saying that they could have gotten 2 volleys off before having to reload in that time period, do you think?
Well, one volley is one round.
One round, okay. Could they have gotten, okay, there's a time for reloading is considerable, isn't it?
20 seconds.
Oh, well, that's not too bad.
Yeah.
Okay.
Got to do 3 in a minute. So
Oh,
that would be 20 seconds apiece.
okay. 3 in a minute.
Still pretty hard to do. If you've ever
Yeah.
done it, it's difficult.
I've watched people doing it at ceremonies, and so you know firsthand, obviously.
Yeah. It takes
But,
time.
yeah. But so they rose up and they blasted the British that were in the water. And guess what? The British changed their mind and went back to their ships. They managed to kill 15 and wounded 20. So now the British haven't given up. They come up with another way of trying to burn Falmouth. And they had what we would today call incendiary cannonballs, the kind where you can shoot it from a distance, and when it lands, it bounces and bounces and bounces until it hits the structure, and then it bursts into flames. Well, what's the date here? April 3rd. What do we know about April 3rd? There's just been a beginning of a thaw for spring, and the ground is all soggy. So these incendiary bombs went and they went thud, They didn't bounce. So that failed, and the British changed their mind and went on to the vineyard instead. So I think that's quite a story. But that's what's known as the Battle of Falmouth in 1779. I had an ancestor who was in that. That's his grave in Old Burying Ground in Falmouth. He was a fifer. He was 16 years old. And a fifer in warfare in that time, just like drummers, played signals. There wasn't just music, such as attack or retreat. And so we had a little ceremony to mark his grave. And he was later in the War of 1812 as, of course, a more mature person.
Was that cannonball the one that ended up at the old Nimrod in the wall?
That's the one that was fired by a British ship in the War of 1812. Yeah, right. It's often we confuse those two because that's a great story in itself. So everything winds down. 1781, Cornwallis surrenders, and we'll go to the next slide. So the Treaty of Paris 2 years later ended the war, and there was a very slow economic recovery, not just on Cape Cod and the islands, but elsewhere. Loyalists, a lot of them left and went to Canada. And then we have the Constitution, 87, and then the War of 1812 starts it all again in a different way for different reasons. So I have information here if anybody wants to try to prove that they're descended from a Revolutionary War ancestor. And I guess we can go to the last slide. And that's just about the book. So I'll be very glad to answer questions or take comments on all of this.
How long did it take you and your friends to compile all of this?
It was about 3 years, yeah. The interesting thing about it is that we realized that we needed people who had expertise about particular things. And so we have 24 co-authors. But every person in there is talking about something that she or he knows in some depth about. And then you put it all together and you've got the whole picture for Cape and Islands. Yes?
So I've often been curious and somewhat in awe of the people of those times making the decision to either be a loyalist or a patriot. Same with the Civil War.
Yep.
And other wars that we've gone into, and even though, as history reflects, perhaps World War II was a little bit more supported than other subsequent wars, but that ability to make those decisions, and you really don't know if you're doing the right thing.
You're absolutely right. It's a wrenching kind of thing, and it split families, and in the Civil War too. You have to think about, well, yes, there's the bigger cause about becoming a nation or not, but how does that affect me personally or my family? I'm sure it was difficult.
Ben Franklin and his son, wasn't it? Benjamin Franklin and his son, that was...
Very, very important figure. But Ben Franklin was in favor of not becoming a separate nation for a long while. He was our representative in England, but and he often testified before Parliament. But then one time in Parliament, somebody publicly criticized him terribly, and he said, "That's it." And he came home, and he joined the Patriot cause, and of course was very important in the development of the Declaration. But he was in favor of somehow repairing things. And some people look back on that and they say, well, maybe that wouldn't have been such a bad thing because we'd be more like Canada today, and then we could go on to about that. But anyway, yes?
You passed over the tar and feathering of some.
Yes, our colonial forebears were not always nice people, okay? And there are the atrocities on both sides in military conflict. And one of the things they did in Barnesville Village, they picked out a loyalist woman, Abby Freeman, and they tarred and feathered her. Think about having hot pine tar poured all over your body and then have feathers thrown at it, and then being marched on a rail through the village. It's a public shaming thing. So, yeah, I shouldn't have just gone past that so quickly, because that's part of the picture too. Yeah.
Yeah, the thing with Franklin and his son, I got this from a documentary that I got here.
Yeah.
He developed the postal road,
Yes.
the postal route. He was the first postmaster general.
Yes.
And he developed that. Well, he used to take his kid to work, up and down.
Right.
Through all the colonies, the fastest, best way to get from point A to point B.
Right.
And his son being the loyalist, for some reason, I don't know, it's probably in his documentary, but the kid told the British, he was a British informant, he told them the best route all the way up and down the colony, so they were able to use that like the Ho Chi Minh Trail.
Exactly. Exactly. Yep. No, that's true, and that's right in the same family. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
That's why they were
Yeah.
strange.
No, he had the information and he passed it along. Oh.
And got well paid, I'm sure.
Well, to look at it from his point of view, he was appointed by the Crown to be a governor of one of 13 colonies, a pretty nice position, and he maintained his loyalty to the people who had appointed him, and Franklin said, going the other way. Yeah. So, all right. Well, if anyone would like to look at the book or purchase, it's $25 cash or check, and I'll stay around a while. So, thank you for coming.
Thank you.